We can actually draw two types of aggregate supply curve for the short run if we wanted to. One is a horizontal aggregate supply curve, and this would be a fair representation when, for example, in a recession where there's mass unemployment, there's a lot of idle resources. So in this case, firms have so much excess capacity that they can increase their output, which we're representing with Y, without their marginal costs rising. That is, the law of diminishing marginal returns doesn't apply to the vast majority of firms in this kind of situation. Thus, they can increase their output without having to increase their prices to cover higher marginal costs, because there aren't higher marginal costs. Another short-running aggregate supply curve would look like this. It would be the upward sloping one, and that is in your textbook and is in most textbooks. So in this case, we would say that here firms are subject to the law of diminishing marginal returns. So as they increase output, their marginal costs rise, and thus to cover their higher marginal costs, they will need to charge and will charge higher prices. So in this case, we get a rise in real GDP and a corresponding rise in the general level of prices. Then we can contrast that with the long-run aggregate supply curve. This is a supply curve reflecting the full employment or the natural unemployment level of real GDP, or potential real GDP, to which the economy, it's argued by some, to which the economy will tend irrespective of the level of prices. Remember here, full employment doesn't mean no unemployment. It means there is only natural unemployment. And natural unemployment is composed of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. So let's imagine that the economy were operating at the full employment level of real GDP, as is reflected here. And then let's say that for some reason aggregate demand falls. Remember, aggregate demand is composed of C plus I plus G plus NX. So if any of those components of aggregate demand, those components of expenditure, fall independently of the general level of prices, then we'd have something like this. The economy would gravitate to the new equilibrium of the short-run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve here. So then the economy would be operating at an equilibrium point below full employment. And we call the gap between those two levels of real GDP a deflationary gap, because we can see that the general level of prices fell, or the prices deflated. Okay, here we're going to do the opposite to what we just had a look at. So say we're at the economy is operating at the full employment level of real GDP, as it is here. And then for some reason or other, aggregate demand increases. There might be an autonomous increase in consumption expenditure, or investment expenditure, or government expenditure, or net exports. Let's say that occurs. Then we'll find that the general level of prices will rise and the equilibrium real GDP will rise as well, beyond the full employment level. Now remember, that's not impossible. You might say, well, how can you produce more than the level at which there's full employment. Remember, full employment doesn't mean there's no unemployment. There is still idle labour available, and there might be other idle resources as well, but we normally think in terms of labour, even at the level of full employment. So firms can produce more than the full employment level by drawing upon the natural unemployment, drawing that into the production process. Anyway, the point is that we get an increase in the general level of prices and an increase in the equilibrium GDP beyond full employment. We say the gap between the full employment GDP and the equilibrium GDP in this case is an inflationary gap. Why? Because the general level of prices rose. There was inflation occurring.